Good morning and hello, or hello. My name is Peter Daniel Bernal, also known as Pedro Longoria Ortiz Perez Bernal y Perez. And I'm an artist from Texas who now lives in Detroit, Michigan. And unfortunately, as you probably know, since the bankruptcy and since a lot of Detroit has a lot of issues with poverty and blight, um, the bright side is that a lot of nature is returning. And in fact, this week in Detroit, the Packard plant is being demolished. It's the largest building in Detroit, and it once represented all that was great about American industry. And it's such a strange thing to hear it being torn down. It's too broken. It can't be revitalized. I'm very American. That's something I'd like to talk about if it comes up in the conversation, because as you know, the zeitgeist in America is very complicated, and it sort of demands, in my estimation, it demands me saying something about it and putting sort of my own sort of face on it, because I have multiple identities, even from representing just myself. It's actually connected to the way that my identity is, because my name is formally like Pedro Longoria or Ortiz Perez Bernal y Perez, but I just go by Peter Bernal, the English version, because I'm in America. So it's like, and one thing that I'd like to also mention is that I can't speak Spanish, or it's very abysmal, for a very good reason, and that's something I'd like to talk about. It has to do with the way that I was raised. I am a painter that is somebody who is trying to find where I live in this world. I think one of my primary missions is to establish my value as a person and assert myself in this world. And painting has just become my language. I was born in Houston, Texas. My family is from the Valley, which is Victoria, Texas, Runge, south of San Antonio. And colloquially, we've been known as Tejano. That is, I have many different identifiers. Tejano is what we called ourselves, or Tex-Mex is another name for it. My heritage goes back since before record keeping. We don't really know much about our history, and that's one of the reasons why I am going to where I'm going within my painting. I also identify as Chicano. Technically speaking, according to the government, I'm Latino and Hispanic, although I don't really use those. I don't use Latino and Hispanic to describe myself, because those describe sort of the colonial aspects of where I come from. I am thoroughly Texan. I am a native Texan, and the peoples that I would have belonged to were the Cahuilotec. For all intents and purposes, that culture was completely erased. And it's become especially meaningful in my art more recently. As I get older, I'm learning more about my own heritage. I'm sure you've known about abuse towards Native children in Canada from the Catholic Church, and I could say with relative confidence that the same thing happened to my own culture hundreds of years ago, or perhaps even as recently as 150 or 100 years ago. And my other identifiers, like I said, I am not Catholic anymore, and that's also kind of one of the reasons why I paint, because I struggle with this thing, because I am culturally very Catholic. I still have a lot of things in my life that I still lean to, like Our Lady of Guadalupe is an important symbol. I use that in my paintings sometimes, but like I said, I kind of reject the Latino reference, because I'm not Catholic anymore. I'm not from a Latin American country. I'm from America, but the border, I didn't immigrate. The country did. I can't really speak Spanish, and that's for a good reason. I'll explain in a minute. So what I really care about too is finding out the truth, and that's one of the reasons why my sort of faith in Catholicism kind of cracked. Everyone in my family spoke Spanish. I come from like this, ever since the colonials came, ever since the conquistadors came, my family was speaking a completely different language that is completely lost. There may be remnants of a different culture. I come from a long line of farmers, farmhands, and laborers, fruit pickers, in other words. As a child, my mom and her sisters were cotton pickers, and they were child laborers, and they did not get paid. My grandfather was a sharecropper. He didn't really get paid either, although he was allowed to live on the farm. That's another word for slavery. But the problem is, though, is that it's not really recognized as part of the chattel slavery problem that America has always had. So when my parents grew up, she was punished for speaking Spanish at school because it was mostly an Anglo community. Anglo meaning like American settlers that have English roots, of course. There was a lot of prejudice towards my mother. She would get punished for speaking Spanish, laughed at for bringing tacos to school, and her English was not very good until much later. So when I came around, my mom had the vision of me and my brothers having a better life. She withheld speaking Spanish to us to give us a better chance in school. And I really understand that. She really tried because she had a hard upbringing. But of course, our days are different now. Of course, speaking multiple languages is an advantage. But back in those days, that was the pre-civil rights era, and it made it difficult for my family. And so I can't speak Spanish. I'd like to, but then there's other personal reasons why I haven't pursued it. I come from a difficult family myself. My father and I didn't get along. And whenever I would get punished as a kid, he would yell at me in Spanish and all these other things. And it's like, I still love the language. I think it's a beautiful language, but I also have to embrace who I am instead of who I'm supposed to be. And that's another reason why I really like to talk about these things. It's difficult, but the older I get, I'm really starting to just now, I'm 44, just now learning how to be myself.
So in Texas, how did you discover art?
Also, funnily enough, through the Catholic Church, I was a very devoted child. And as soon as I started showing any sort of ability, the priest at my church was from Neuenen in Holland, in the Netherlands, Father Michael. And he introduced Vincent van Gogh to me, and I fell in love with it. Funnily enough, in Detroit, there's a Vincent van Gogh major exhibition here, Vincent van Gogh in America. That I fell in love with painting because, of course, as you know, Vincent van Gogh's colors are very thick. They're very sensuous. They're like frosting on a cake. And not only that, but all artists like that. Like another artist would be like Henry Ossawa Tanner was a major influence to me as a child.
What were your first experiences? What did you do? Did you paint? Did you do some crafts?
A lot of drawing. When I was a small kid, I did a lot of drawing, like a lot of other children, but with crayons and everything. And crayons were great, but I always had like a little problem with like the color being rich enough. I'm like, the spread could be redder. You could see the paper through it. And then when I discovered oil pastels through my school, I got very lucky. Let me be clear. I got very lucky because I grew up in Houston, and I had the opportunity to go to a good school. And so they gave us supplies like oil pastels. I got to try acrylics for the first time. Then I moved to oils, and I just think oils are fantastic because the colors are so rich. And even today, it's like I look at colors and I think it feels like when you were a child and you get a box of crayons for the first time. It has that sense of joy that I love. I kind of knew early on, but I also got a lot of encouragement from like I said, the priest at my church and my school. Unfortunately, my parents didn't understand art. Like I said, we came from like a working class background. They didn't understand it. Although my culture is very deep in the arts, my family was just more like on the naive part of that spectrum. And I also got to say, I really leaned hard into it in sort of the spiritual sense. Um, as an aside, I've had a lot of problems with mental health throughout my life. I leaned very hard into the Catholic faith because it provided some sense of comfort. But so did art. And art to me always had this kind of angle that allowed me to be me and allowed me to have some peace. So I kind of associate the two together. So, that also has to do with the way that my painting looks now.
Your art shows a lot of introspection into your roots, into your multiple identities.
Yes. And so when I paint, though, I'm on a quest to discover more about myself. When I paint, I don't try to I try to leave my ego out of it. I try not to say, "Hey, look at me, look at what I can do. Look how great it is." And you'll notice I don't do any self portraits for that reason. It's more of a I'm really digging deep into those roots and where I come from. I find that interesting. And being in America, the United States, um, it's a question that I think everyone asks sooner or later. Where do we come from?
People seem to be very attached to this idea of affiliation. Where do you come from?
Yes.
Why do you think is that important?
Um, it's become important in America because I think we're in sort of this crux or this sort of crossroads where I think America kind of requires a second civil rights movement, a la Martin Luther King in the 60s. Um, it's important because it affects the life quality of people like myself and people from other Hispanic backgrounds and African American backgrounds and many other cultures. I don't want to leave anybody out, Asian cultures and so on. Um, it's made life very difficult to be a person of color in certain parts of the country. And right now I live in Michigan, and it can be very difficult, especially if you're black or somebody who looks like you're from somewhere else. Native American people have had a lot of problems in the North for a long time. And as an aside, I'm discovering more about my own Native American roots, which is why I don't lean too hard into the Latino identity. Um, to find one's personal identity, to answer your question, is important because it sort of puts your foot down saying, this is who I am. You must accept it. I'm not going to change for you anymore because that didn't work for hundreds of years. We have to be ourselves. And I think that is also one of the big roots about Americanness is the assertion of a personal identity is, I think, what America is really one of the great things about America is that I think a lot of people maybe rightfully don't trust the science institutions towards people of color. I have a relatively good confidence in science. I really like science very much. I try to learn everything about it. I personally subscribe to a methodological naturalism, that sort of philosophical background between science and learning and stuff. Anyway, I think science in our modern era has provided some answers for our ancestors. I only knew who I was through word of mouth through my family, but I've done like these blood tests and DNA tests that have definitively proven who I am, and that creates a certain level of confidence, of ownership towards this continent. I belong here. That's why it's important. It's not like I'm an immigrant. Just I have immigrants in my family. But I wanted to make it clear that as a Chicano person, I'm not an immigrant. I belong to this continent. I think it's really troublesome that a lot of our black friends don't know where they came from, and a lot of my Native American friends as well don't. My own culture was erased. But ironically, I think one of the things that is really reassuring is that I know of my culture's history because of art. An example being the Aztec codices, the Olmec jade sculptures, the large heads and everything. We know these cultures because of art, and the same because of African art. It's a beautiful thing that art does that.
How did you bring into the university system your own values?
It was very tricky because when I was a child or teenager going into my college, it was tricky because I was still trying to figure out who I was. I was much more of a passive person because of I was very, very religious. And going into an art school has a reputation of being the exact opposite, right? So it's much more secular and rigorous and academic. I soaked it in like a sponge. However, I always tried to turn it into something for myself. Um, I hope I'm not getting too far off track, but I wanted to say my work is figurative for a very deliberate reason. That is because of my Catholic roots, but it's also a sort of a way to assert myself in a very postmodern world. I have a postmodern education in art school. That is to say, learning how to think, really questioning everything. I'm a skeptic, And I think it's an extremely valuable tool. I think my education was extremely valuable for that reason. Having said that, there were some problems, of course, when it came to ideas of class and culture. My school was, I would say, 90%, 95% white and of some sort of Christian variation, but also I discovered atheism through that. Um, it's really tricky though, because I use my figurative art as a reverse appropriation, and to me that is utterly critical, because I would say my art, of course, it all has some sort of roots in history, but mine is not that. I don't claim history when I make my figurative art. I'm using it simply as a language to explain where I am now. I hope I'm not getting too far off track, but it's very stimulating, this conversation.
You were in Texas, and then at some point you decided to move to Germany. How did that happen?
Well, funnily enough, I worked in Houston. I've been working in the museum world since, as a contractor. I started in 2002, and then I started working in the museum since 2003 to 2004. My wife was an art. She's an art restorer, a conservator, and she came to Houston as a Mellon Fellow at the museum I was working at, the Bernal Foundation. And we met there, fell in love. It was nice. And since 9/11, the immigration rules have changed a lot. So she had to return to Germany when her contract expired. But we were already in love, and we decided to get married, and then we moved together to Germany. And I took that opportunity because I love German art. I really do, especially as a former Catholic. I really love German art. As an aside, too, I love my wife very much, but she's exact opposite of my mom. So I just thought that would be fun to sort of notice, because all this quest of trying to find who I am, I reach out of it. I also think it's a good thing to do as a person in general, is just to leave one's comfort zone or leave home from time to time.
So, how was Weimar?
It was a dream, but there were some dark parts too. I have to fully concede that I had some mental health issues that sort of came up when I moved to Germany. A major life change has the potential to cause things like this. Like, I had a panic disorder issue. Other than that, the people were super kind. It's kind of funny, but I felt more welcome there than I did in Houston, because I had the label of immigrant. And I found it liberating. I was treated very well. I had the right to work as an American. I could just easily get a job in Weimar. Um, I was part of it said BK, which is the immigration. Yeah, I had to learn the language, and I had to learn German history. I was allowed to join the artists union, which changed my life, or changed the way that I look at art. Um, as also an aside, I had a lot of trouble being an artist at the beginning, because my parents worked so very hard to help me get an education, and they were laborers. And here I am, an artist, which is considered very comfortable and very dreamy. So it's like this funny thing, but meeting these artists gave me a place to sit, gave me a place to be comfortable as an artist. For example, I was one of the only Americans in that group, a union of about, maybe in my local region, maybe about 150, 200 artists. And they were very dedicated and serious, which gave me sort of this concrete place to be confident as an artist. Many of them spent time in jail because they made art during the East Communist regime. And I'm like, if they can do that, then I can sort of get over myself and go full force into becoming an artist, instead of just feeling apologetic about it.
Living in Germany, did that influence your your style, your palette, anything?
Yes. A lot of my inspiration up until that point was very Mexican, and I loved figurative painting in general, just because of you know, there's things about it that I just find appealing, as far as conveying stories and such. But in Germany, I had like residencies there. I had some mentorships, and I got a really very deep education there through German figurative painting, especially early Christian art. And I'm speaking of like these altarpieces. Like I can say artists like Tillman Riemenschneider really made a big difference in my art, and also art of East Germany, like Wolfgang Matoya is somebody I really admire as far as his art is concerned. If you see his art, you might see where I'm coming from. And it has a certain power because the people that made art because they had to. This is like the most basic human need of expression that was squeezed under like certain regimes. And I could say, I could say that America is in danger of turning into that. And so I think those tools that I learned in East Germany are very valuable now. Well, that was a little bit of economics. We lived very well in Germany because it's like I think the cost of living is more manageable. Our jobs enabled us to make a pretty fair living in Germany. But unfortunately, we were going from contract to contract. My wife was working at the museum in Erfurt near Weimar. But then, since Detroit was coming through a revitalization and the museum was looking for more help after the bankruptcy, my wife saw this and said we couldn't resist. It's just too much of a good thing. It provides the promise of permanence and the promise of finding roots because we had been moving a lot up until that point.
In Detroit, now everything changed in terms of colors, lifestyle. Did you have a culture shock? It was different from Texas, it was different from Germany.
Yes, I did. As a Texan, I'm also a Southerner, so I kind of like lean towards like Southern mannerisms and things like that, like this general sense of belonging and friendliness that I knew. I mean, amongst my immediate circle, I can say that there's parts in Texas that I just absolutely would run away from because it's dangerous for people that are different, or like getting like. But moving up north was a culture shock because I'm like, here I am, a Southerner living up north, but their ideas of cultural justice is totally different. There's the pretense that the North in America is more just and didn't have slavery, so therefore it's better. Well, in my experiences, it's not. It's there's this avoidance of reckoning from like certain cultures up in the North that it's much more polarized here, I could say. Whereas when I grew up, there was a much more thorough assimilation. Maybe not in my own particular life experience, but I can see that in the South, there's at least in Houston, a major city, a sort of like getting along that is, I mean, I don't want to overplay that. I mean, it is still a problem in the South, but I'm missing that here. And so that's another reason why I lean so hard into this aspect of identity within art.
During this time, you've been very productive. A lot of your painting, if not all your painting, deals with issues of ancestry, social justice, history.
Yes. And my art itself, I want to say, is an assertion, an expression in and of itself. Having said that, my work is relatively anti-capitalist. And by that, I mean, I work slow deliberately. I try not to produce for the sake of creating widgets. I make art because I have to, and I want to embrace that. And from things that I learned in Germany, I also believe that there's too much dependence on artists making a living. And so I'm like, but that hurts the quality of the art. I want to make art whole and pure as much as I can make it. So I create some things in my life that create a shield from that. And so if I want to take a month to make a painting, I will. If I wanted to take a year, then I will. I kind of reject this pressure to be a producer or like to chase that golden ring, which I find to be a major problem in the arts, especially for artists of color. This is something I'm very passionate about, so forgive me if I kind of trail off, but I'll try not to. Artists of color have had, just like any other human being, have had something to say but weren't listened to up until fairly recently. And it's still kind of a problem. I find it liberating to make any kind of art that I want to make. Even though there's this pressure, and I know my education to make art a certain way, I reject it because I feel like the art doesn't artists themselves as people, as human beings, don't have enough power. And so I think making art in and of itself is an act of rebellion. And I embrace that. And I kind of wish I could educate people where I'm coming from. Art itself is an act of rebellion, and we need to protect it from money. Money's great. I would love to have a lot of it, I mean, but I also recognize I don't want to do it at the expense of my soul or at the expense of a worker that's not getting paid. I think that's kind of terrible. I must say it's been positive. It's been very positive lately because I think there's a need, not just for me, but also people of my own community, Latinos, uh, Chicanos, especially Native American, to put our foot in the pantheon of art. And I get support for that reason. In Detroit, I'm sort of trying to build or establish the sense of unity. That is to say, I'm joining a lot of African American artists, and we're uniting our voice to make certain types of art. Like, for example, today I'm going to be working on a mural with Hubert Massey, who's one of Detroit's great artists. And it's an honor to be able to combine our voices that way.
When did you start doing murals?
I did a few in Germany. Most of them were just like commissions for I did one for a hospice, and I did another for a personal commission. But I'm like, Germany has a lot of public art, and I'm like, I want to do that. I really want to do that because a lot of artists that I love did murals. I could even argue that my earlier ancestors did murals by doing chalk drawings or doing cave paintings. I want to do that. And so when I came to Detroit, I had that opportunity because there's a blight problem in Detroit, and I think art helps sort of offset it a lot. But also there's a lot of walls and a lot of culture that is available for being taken advantage of. There's a lot of artists here that want to do murals, and I don't blame them. This is a great city to do murals in. And it's a way to share my ideas in the same way like a musician performing at a concert, you can play it louder and get more people to understand where you're coming from. I have several murals around the city of Detroit. I have maybe about a cumulative of, I want to say, 15 murals. But the one I'm doing now with Hubert is extremely large. So I don't know how many that counts as. It's a very large mural, like 1,000 feet long. And I'd like to do more in the future, but I also really focus on my canvas paintings a lot. So that's where a lot of my time is dedicated.
So how is your palette today?
Oh, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. I love colors, just like any child would, or I just still get excited. My I use a lot of oils. I make sure my paint is very thick. Feels so good under the brush to use heavy impasto. One of my favorite French painters is probably Gustave Courbet, and it's just so sensual and just my colors are pretty much full palette. Depending on the subject, I try to lean towards a more muted palette or maybe focusing directly on the story. Like if I'm doing a painting about a dream, it might be more muted. But if I'm doing an angry painting, which I've been doing a lot of lately, if I do an angry painting, it will be very loud and angry, and I use whatever color makes my point heard.
I looked at your colors, and in your murals, you seem to be using more vibrant colors, while in your paintings, your palette is a bit darker.
Yes, I think vibrancy just reads differently with bright colors when you're outside, and I like that. But I think my personal, smaller canvases are darker because I think there's a lot more room for introspection. And as you know, I struggle a bit with mental health, and I let that dog loose, so to speak, as it uses an American expression. I let it loose, and if it's going to be dark, that's how it's going to be. And maybe some of my Catholic art roots are leaking into it, like Caravaggio, or one of my personal favorites from those days were Guido Reni and in others, you know. So I do lean towards the dark in that sense.
I have seen in your paintings a contrast between the sizes. For example, you would show large humans holding small boats or crashing small houses.
Yes. Oh, I just wanted to. I have an easy answer for that. A lot of it comes from nightmares, and a lot of it has to do with like sort of this idea of a child playing with a toy and wanting to do something or wanting to change something. This sort of like aspect of a dream, the seed of a change. I just think it's an interesting image to do that. I think it's much more difficult. I mean, I'm sure another artist could, but for me, it's much more difficult to convey something without playing with scale. A lot of early German art did that too, by the way.
So you were quite influenced by the German art.
Yeah, and the reason for that was that I always got the sense that there was this, and I bring it up a lot, so I apologize. But there's this deep sense of devotion through Christianity that I really leaned very hard into. That's another aspect that I maybe should mention. I really deeply believed in a lot of the theology, and the dedication was very inspiring. The fact that somebody would dedicate their life to making an image of Christ made me cry. It was so beautiful. And I would say also the same for other cultures. I really like the idea of craftsmanship. One of my favorite values in a human being is their idea of devotion and commitment. I really appreciate that, whether it be working on a car or being a house painter. I really love it when people devote themselves, when people care. But things shifted in my 20s, and actually when I became 30, it became very difficult, and it's tied to my mental health, where I decided I had to leave the church. And my art became sort of conflicted. I don't know if it can be seen, but my art changed a lot in that period.
Are you invited in schools?
From time to time, I am. It's been a little bit. Mostly, I think COVID has sort of thrown a monkey wrench in all of these, but I'd like to do something in the future.
Are you planning group shows or solo shows?
I have a show coming up in about a month and a half in Hatch. It's in Hamtramck, Michigan, which is a suburb, or not really. It's an inner city to Detroit. It's a little town within a town. And I have been refraining from showing because I really want to focus on the painting itself. That's something I can't convey enough. The painting is extremely important to me. I dedicate as much time per day as I can. Unfortunately, real life takes place a lot, so I don't have as much time as I'd like. So I would show more, but my hands are full.
You have known Peter for how many years?
2006.
Since 2006, yes.
So you know a lot about his art. How did Peter's art evolve from university to now?
Well, I didn't know him when he was still a student. So he was already a working and well-formed artist when I met Peter. I do think as an artist, you always get better with life experience, with doing it. Like, you mature, right? It's always you have more to say, and you are maybe clearer in what you have to say. You're more sure of who you are, what your voice is.
His art is very complex.
Yes.
How you as European, how did you bridge your European culture to his multiple identities?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the one thing is that I thought was interesting is when I met Peter, that, for example, I was surprised that he knew a lot about, like, for example, German expressionism, new objectivism, like the art of like the 1920s, Paula Modersohn-Becker. Like, I wasn't expecting that. And also an interest and a knowledge of medieval art, European medieval art, which I would always have considered obscure, even in Germany, right?
But there's that link with Mexican art too. I wanted to throw
Yeah,
in there.
like the connect. I mean, obviously, okay. As an ignorant European, I may have first thought of Peter more like, oh, like a Diego Rivera, sort of simplifying that kind of like, yeah, Mexican, like almost surrealist, fantastical painting. But I really do think that it's highly complex and sophisticated, and that there is a deep knowledge. And yes, because of our history and of the exploitation of what is now the Americas, I do obviously think that the painting influences from Europe are strong in Peter, but I do still think that he's using them as a human, right? As a universal good. And that they're still entwined with a lot of language and traditions from his specific culture. And that I think, I mean, when Peter was showing in Europe or in Germany, number one, I'm not sure if Peter told you, but we were living in East Germany with a lot of and we met a lot of the dissident painters. And I felt there was a connection because of the urge to express and the urge to paint and the urge to find clarity in a very complicated world through painting, that I think is unique. But I always feel that there is the human language of art, right? That transcends traditions and borders.
The human need.
The human need,
yeah. Same with like people that in villages that we've never visited before.
Yeah.
There's that universal connection that I really admire as an artist.
What would you like the viewers take away from this interview?
If I were speaking to the audience now, and especially somebody who's not in America, I would say that I think there's a lot. I want people to know that there's a lot of people in this country that very much care about the state of the world and don't like what America has become in the more recent years. Art has become an extremely valuable tool and sometimes a weapon that no regime can destroy. They might be able to break the sculptures, but art will persevere so as long as they're artists. And I say, if you have somebody in your family that's an artist, be nice to them. You know, if you have a child, buy them some art supplies. Express yourself. I just happen to be painting, but the human expression is something that no dictator can take away. They might try, but there will be somebody else that can do it. So I just wanted to say, art is much more important than sometimes we give it credit.
How can people find your art and learn about your art?
Over time, I'm becoming more present on the internet. For a long time, I avoided because when I was in Germany, there was this privacy issue. I avoided it for a very long time. Edward Snowden's scandal and so on. I'm becoming more present on the internet. I am not online except for just my website, and occasionally you might find something through a gallery. But the longer I'm in Detroit, the more I'm going to settle in. I'm establishing myself with different galleries as we speak, and so there will be more for me in the future. I don't know how relevant it is, but I think one of the things that is difficult, it's very difficult to operate as an artist in America, mostly for economic reasons. And so I think I'm really proud of other artists that are in America that are able to get through. And it's very difficult. It was a lot easier in Germany, I got to say, but if that has any relevance whatsoever, I think it might be worth noting. Art supplies are very expensive. Having to work to pay rent, education, everyone is. My society is very difficult on artists. So, just for what it's worth.
How can people get in touch with you?
Through my email at tealgreenred@gmail.com. The colors. And one more thing I wanted to say about my art. I don't know how it would tie in. One more thing, just before, because I am excited. I make sure that my art is epistemically sound. I have a good reason for doing what I'm doing. I goof around too, by the way. I mean, when I'm bored, sometimes I'll draw comics. I love comics too, but I take it, I want to make sure that my art really is relevant to where I'm at. That's all.